Great. I see our attendees are growing. So thank you again for joining today's webinar, Mobilizing Impact, How Global Forest Watch Drives Innovation and Collaboration to Combat Deforestation. Today's webinar will be hosted in English, but we'll be providing simultaneous interpretation to Spanish and French throughout the webinar. So with that, I'll get started in just a minute. I'll introduce myself. I'm Isabella Barriga. I'm a Community Engagement Manager for Global Forest Watch. I'll be your moderator throughout today's webinar. If we can go to the next slide, please. So as I mentioned, today's webinar is hosted in English, but we will provide simultaneous interpretation to Spanish and French. So if you look at the Zoom navigation bar, you can see this globe icon that says interpretation. So feel free to select which language you would prefer to hear today's webinar in. So I'll give everyone a chance to select their preferred language. I also wanted to note that we'll be taking questions and comments through the Q&A button, also in Zoom. We'll save time at the end for all questions. So I'll give everyone a chance to very quickly select the language they'd like to hear the webinar in. Okay, great. We can go to the next slide, please. I will walk us through the agenda for today's webinar. So we're going to start with a welcome and introduction to today's topic. We've broken up the discussion into two parts. We'll first focus on how countries have used GFW to monitor deforestation rates and how reporting has evolved and led to impact. Then we'll focus on how partners we invited today have been able to monitor deforestation in supply chains with data and technology, leading to further innovation and partnerships. Next slide, please. For those who may not be familiar, Global Forest Watch, known as GFW, provides an openly accessible suite of tools designed to help people monitor deforestation everywhere. The geospatial forest monitoring has helped usher in a new era of accountability and radical transparency for the world's forests, setting in motion system-wide changes in how the world's forests are understood, monitored, and protected. And we've seen this has contributed to the evolution of partnerships collaborating for a common mission to halt deforestation worldwide. We celebrated Global Forest Watch 10th anniversary earlier this year, and we kicked off our Voices of GFW series to highlight the successes of our users, partners, and community members throughout the year who have made this work possible. You can go to the next slide. For this webinar, we're going to be focusing on how Global Forest Watch data and tools have enabled users to reduce, prevent, and raise awareness around deforestation. We'll also talk about how partners have harnessed GFW's data and technology, in addition to other technology, to develop new kinds of solutions for public good to drive transformational change, whether to empower journalists or clean up supply chains. So thank you again for joining our webinar. I'm going to introduce our great lineup of speakers in the next slide. So we're joined by Fred Stoll, Deputy Director of the Deborah I. Forest Program, Liz Goldman, Senior GIS Research Manager for Global Forest Watch, Willie Schubert, Vice President of Programs and Executive Editor at Mongabay, and Remy D'Annunzio, Science and Data Lead for the Forest Data Partnership Forest Officer at FAO. So thank you to our great lineup of speakers. You're going to hear more from them during their presentations in just a moment, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Just a reminder, you'll be hearing from all our speakers. We'll have some time for the Q&A at the end, so feel free to share your questions throughout the webinar. And with the next slide, I will hand it off to our first speaker, Liz Goldman, to walk us through the beginning and the development of Global Forest Watch, including the annual tree cover loss data and reporting.
Great, thank you. Great, thank you, Isabella. So nice to be here. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So for 10 years now, Global Forest Watch has been releasing annual data updates to the tree cover loss data from the University of Maryland. And this is really at the heart of what Global Forest Watch is all about and why GFW was created in the first place, to provide annual, transparent, globally consistent, and easy to access data that help the average person understand the world's forests. And with this data, we can see where tree cover loss is occurring, where things are getting worse or better, and we can now do things like hone in on primary forest loss, determine the major causes of loss, quantify carbon emissions associated with tree cover loss, and determine whether forest loss is declining fast enough to meet commitments to end loss by 2030. But it wasn't always like this, and I wanted to take us through the evolution of our reporting to show just how much we've grown over the past 10 years and how reporting can evolve through these incremental improvements that really do add up over time. So next slide. I want to take us back to the spring of 2016 when we got our first big, one of our first big updates from the University of Maryland. Michaela Weiss, who's now the director of Global Forest Watch. She and I were both analysts at the time. And I remember sitting in an office with her, with Nancy Harris, who's now the co-director of Research for Land and Carbon Lab, and us saying, this is interesting data, interesting findings. I guess we should write a blog about this. And we proceeded to do that and released it alongside a map update on Global Forest Watch, and then kind of moved on and with the rest of our work. So as you can see from this graph, we're able to report that almost 20 million hectares of tree cover were lost in 2015. And we were able to do this down to the country level and even the subnational area too at the time. But there were a lot of important limitations to this data that restricted what we could confidently say when we were first publishing these annual releases, because the data from the University of Maryland measures tree cover loss. It doesn't distinguish between natural and planted forests. It doesn't have information about drivers. It doesn't have information about gain. And so we weren't really able to tell a very complete picture about how and why forests were changing. And before I move on, I did want to say also that 2016 was the year when we released our first 30-meter resolution deforestation alert product too, which allowed users to track deforestation in near real time and take action at a much faster time scale. And there's a really interesting evolution to the alert data too, and the kinds of reporting that can be done with that type of information that I don't really have time to talk about, but my co-presenter Willie will be covering some of that soon. So next slide. We were in this place for several years where, we were just reporting on tree cover loss for the 2016 release, the 2017 release, and then finally in 2018, for the 2018 release, we had this glimmer of what we would be able to report on in the coming years, because this was the year that the University of Maryland released a primary forest data set for Brazil, DRC, and Indonesia, which allowed us to remove the noise of tree plantation rotations and really focus in on primary forest loss, which is important to monitor for a number of reasons. These are places that typically have higher levels of biodiversity. They store more carbon and therefore emit more carbon emissions when deforestation occurs. And they represent a more permanent change. When primary forests are cut, when they're lost, in many cases, they're not going to return to a primary forest state in any of our lifetimes. So we were able to use this data for the first time in select countries. And then, as you can see from the annotations on the graph, we were also starting to talk to other experts in the field, our country level contacts, and understand the data as well. So we were able to say, oh, the spikes in loss in 2016 and 2017, those were due to fire activity. Next slide. Then in 2019 is when the next, the big major release happened, data release happened from the University of Maryland. They expanded this primary forest data from just 3 countries to now cover the entire humid tropics, which allowed us to offer this consistent comparison across countries that is so central to Global Forest Watch, and again, hone in on the kind of loss in these important forests that is critical to be reporting on. Next slide. Then if we fast forward to the 2021 release, this is the first year that we had a 30-meter driver information or data set available to differentiate tree cover loss from fires across the globe. And this was a big leap forward because, as you can see, fires are playing an increasingly important role in forest dynamics in the tropics and also outside the tropics, of course, with massive fires happening in Canada, Russia, parts of Europe in recent years. And so being able to monitor this driver specifically has really helped to bring attention to forest fires and just better capture this increase in fire activity that we're seeing around the world. Next slide. And we were able to apply this data, again, at the country level, at the subnational level. And instead of just having these annotations in 2016 and 2017 in Brazil, we could actually quantify how much of the loss was associated with fires in those specific years. Next slide. 2021 was also the year when we released our Global Forest Review, which some of you might be familiar with. This is a living report that's updated throughout the year and covers the state of the world's forests. And we learned over the years that, it's not always enough to just publish a lot of data sets and hope that people figure it out. Oftentimes we really need to offer our findings and our insights from those data as well. And so to do this, the Global Forest Review offers findings from many Global Forest Watch data sets by looking at them through the lens of different indicators of forest extent, forest condition, protected versus production designation status, biodiversity and ecological services, and social and governance issues as well. It also features sections on country trends and has become a home for our annual tree cover loss releases so that people who are reading about those annual releases can then jump over to other sections and understand this bigger picture of data-driven forest insights. And then next slide. Lastly, the most recent change that's made it into our reporting is that we now offer a targets tracker on the Global Forest Review, which puts the latest year of tree cover loss data in the context of commitments to end forest loss by 2030. And as you can see, quantifying this just shows so clearly that we are not on track to meet this commitment. And without this kind of data, we would be kind of, blindly hoping that we are meeting the commitment. But now we are able to every year update this assessment and see if we're on track or not. Next slide. So where have all these data improvements led? Well, one outcome has been just a massive increase in coverage of our data and our findings by the media each year, both in international media and also in media in tropical forest countries as well. And all these data improvements alongside improvements to the Global Forest Watch site, which has made the data easier to access and understand, and careful work done by our communications team has led us from, just 3 women sitting in an office deciding, well, I guess we should write a blog, to now a well-oiled operational initiative that delivers insights on the world's forests and how they're changing each year reliably. Next slide. So to conclude, I just wanted to summarize some of the data improvements that we've discussed and also highlight how they've played out amid this just backdrop of commitments and policies for forests over the past 10 years. So we can see, in this timeline, we have the annual tree cover loss data that was released around 2014 or just before 2014. The GLAD alerts coming online, tropical primary forest data coming online, some things that I didn't even have time to talk about, like our global plantations map, Global Forest Watch Pro, which is our, supply chain focused version of Global Forest Watch, the flux model, radar alerts, Global Forest Review, all these things are coming online while we're also seeing these huge accomplishments and commitments, some of the biggest commitments made for forests. And I don't think it's a coincidence that as our data has become increasingly policy relevant, we've also seen these big commitments and achievements coincide with the ability to openly and transparently monitor forests. So I'm excited to see how Global Forest Watch continues to grow over the next 10 years, because of course there's still important questions and improvements to make to our data, like just some examples, mapping annual gains so that we can better understand net change of forests and not just talk about losses, improving our driver information, and even potentially starting to map change outside of forests in natural vegetation, just to name a few. And I know that Global Forest Watch is going to continue to push the envelope here, helping people make sense of new data sets, forest data sets as they come online, and always making the latest and greatest research and data available so that it's free, transparent, and easy to use for everyone. Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Liz. Amazing to hear about the evolution of GFW from the first blog to now we have this really robust report and all these other different targets tracker data sets. So thank you so much for the really helpful overview. With that, I'm now going to hand off to Willie to talk a bit more about how Mongabay has used some of the data sets that Liz mentioned in their reporting and investigations. Willie, whenever you're ready.
Thanks, Isabella, and good morning from the misty forests of Northern California. My name is Willie Schubert. I'm the executive editor and VP of programs for Mongabay. If you don't know Mongabay, we are a global nonprofit newsroom dedicated to reporting on the world's most important ecosystems, and tropical rainforests are at the heart of this mission. Next slide. And what we do to help make progress on this mission is we're leveraging journalism to create cases or examples where deforestation is stopped before it's had an irreversible impact on the environment. And I think the slide that Liz showed about all of the commitments to reduce deforestation or halt it is an example of the big picture that we're operating in. And if you can go to the next one, next slide. So we're using the near real-time satellite information that Global Forest Watch provides to identify areas where tree cover loss is concerning and follow up with it with on-the-ground reporting and investigation. And the big picture of this impact for 10 years, you can go to the next slide. There's one thing that I want you all to take away from what is the impact over 10 years of Global Forest Watch, in my perspective, is that deforestation is harder to hide and ignorance is not a viable excuse. And I'm going to take you through a couple of case studies today, some of those cases that we've seen, and in the spirit of 10 years of impact, we're going to go back to the beginning of Global Forest Watch to 2014. You can go to the next slide to talk about a case that's relevant to the chocolate industry. And, we know that conversion of rainforest for commercial agriculture is one of the main drivers. And, we're going to, if you can go to the next slide, this is where we're going to be going. You've seen all the dots, pink dots spreading so far. We're going to look into one solid block in northeastern Peru in the Peruvian Amazon near Iquitos. This was one of those, let's go into the story behind the pixels here, but this is where we're talking about. You can go to the next slide. So in 2014, near the end of 2014, a company called United Cacao launched an IPO looking for investors with claims that they were going to be a positive change in the cacao production industry, by following more sustainable practices and labor practices, which was a big issue at that time and continues to be. They made a lot of promises, were able to raise millions of dollars based on this promise because it excited a lot of people. And their goal was to become the largest cacao company operating in Latin America. And unfortunately, this promise simply wasn't true. And we spotted it in the University of Maryland data, that I showed you a little bit earlier. And the company had claimed that they were just working in previously degraded lands, areas that had already been fragmented for agriculture. It wasn't primary forest, that importance of primary forest that Liz was talking about. said, no, this wasn't primary forest. This was already degraded. We're cleaning things up. And if you can go to the next slide. We were able to work with a coalition of scientists, including some partners of GFW, to get down to that annual extent and show that the time period where this 2,000 hectares of forest was cleared had happened right before the run-up to that IPO. And it wasn't degraded before for decades. And this initiated, you can go on to the next slide, going on the ground, finding out what had happened, seeing it in person, verifying that satellite imagery with additional sources of information, also very critical about how there's this network effect around a platform like GFW. If you can continue to the next slide. So this coalition of people and institutions came together to halt this situation because there was a growing demand for more money to keep expanding off of that initial IPO. And all of, the press coverage, both locally and internationally, communities on the ground, local civil society groups, international civil society groups, and importantly, the Peruvian government acted in 2017, more than 2 years later, the CEO of United Cacao and several other executives resigned. And they were delisted from the stock exchange, the London Stock Exchange. So that investment to expand couldn't be delivered in 2019. So this is 5 years later. 3 of the staff of the company's subsidiary in Peru, were sentenced for illegal trafficking of timber forest products. They were given jail time as well as ordered to pay civil reparations. And the prosecutors who were involved in that case, the state's attorneys, said that they used the satellite imagery to reconstruct the history of the forest as evidence in the case. And so this was also, it's a big effort with impact. It takes a community effort. And I'll come back to that, but what was the outcome? You can go to the next slide. Of stopping that investment to continue the expansion. There were almost 100,000 hectares of planned deforestation that was avoided. That's 16 times Manhattan's and over 72 billion miles driven by passenger cars. And so this has a huge nature, biodiversity, intact forest protection impact, but it also has tangible climate impacts too. And so that's, from the early days, but the impact took years and years to coalesce, but are quite real. And I want to talk about what's the more near time impacts. Again, continuing the spirit of 10 years, let's move on to the next slide. So millions of pixels of alerts happening all the time. So journalists like Mongabay and others, not just Mongabay, are informed by this data. And journalists are investigating the causes of recent deforestation in the field. And this is something that I want to talk about as well. There's another case study that's more recent. It has some similarities. Go to the next slide. And this involves the expansion of Mennonite colonies throughout Latin America, which is a topic that we've been covering for many years and is a trend in this conversion, the story of deforestation that's hundreds of years old. And so let's continue. So the alerts that Liz was talking about, the ability to get more real-time information means that we can act faster and find out things as they're happening and report on them more quickly to get information to people so that they can take action with it. Let's keep going. So one example of this is the satellite data can tell us that an area next to one of these colonies had recently built a bridge across a river into a protected wetland site in Bolivia. Okay, that's a bit of news that you can find from the data and a predictor that there may be more expansion coming. People can see that, harder to hide, but they don't feel that. People feel stories, and that's the importance of journalism. And we can go to the next slide. So that's why we have to mobilize and go on the ground to examine and explain through interviews, through analysis. And we're having a picture of one of these farmers in Bolivia, but we also interview indigenous communities that are living in the same place with these colonies. And so there's a very common pattern in plantation agriculture that we can see, plantation expansion. And you can move on to the next slide. That one small story, is very important, but when the data we can use to put the bigger picture into context. And so we use the data from these alerts to find similar areas and patterns of expansion all throughout Latin America and are covering it as a trend. And that awareness and that consistent coverage over time of saying we're going to keep following this did lead to an impact, if you can go to the next slide, in Suriname, which is not on a lot of people's radar for the Amazon. It's on the northern coast, the Caribbean coast of South America. In December of 2023, Mongabay was the first to reveal plans that the government had, the government of Suriname, to develop over 500,000 hectares of forests, about 1% of the country's total forest coverage, 5 times the size of the United Cacao Plan deforestation. They had agreed to a deal to start approving projects in a non-transparent way. And Mongabay revealed that there was a similar coalescing of partners. This map here, you can see on the side, this was a follow-up created by Amazon Conservation using the NICV satellite imagery to show where the colonies are going to be expanding, who's responsible for them. And in June, a few months ago, a court in Suriname approved an injunction on behalf of 12 indigenous and Maroon communities to halt the plan, saying that they did not have free and prior informed consent. And so, this is, again, avoided deforestation, but it's a story that's still ongoing. And these things, they take years and years to keep following. But as I think Liz's presentation really showed quite clearly, that commitment line goes down, this, and if you remember, like the side of the chart said how many million hectares per year, 500,000 hectares, that moves the chart. Just this one project alone moves the chart. And so that's the role of journalists in providing transparency and accountability by enabling access to information. And that's where I'll leave it today. So thank you for having me here, and excited to see what's next as we continue following these commodity plantations, especially commodity crops that have deforestation risk. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Willie. Really impactful to hear about all the different stories that you all produced at Mongabay, building off of the data and the impact this has created. So thank you again for providing those numbers. Really puts things into perspective. At this stage, we'll now shift to the second part of our conversation, so looking at monitoring deforestation and supply chains. I'm now going to hand over to Fred, who's going to provide a bit more context about how data like Global Forest Watch can be used by companies to help monitor deforestation risk in their supply chains, as well as reporting on voluntary commitments. And then following Fred's presentation, we'll hand over to Remy to speak a bit more about the Forest Data Partnership, but Fred will provide the open remarks. Whenever you're ready, Fred.
Sorry, thank you, Isabella, and thank you, Liz and Willie, for this overview. It actually took me back, Willie and Liz's overview, to the start, 2012, 2013, when we dreamt about doing a global deforestation on satellite. And then we thought about maybe we can do it mode as 1 kilometer. Maybe we can do it with another platform that we didn't choose, and see where we are now with this like yearly 30-meter global update. The incredible work that Monga Day is doing on getting this out in the field and making stories. And so how far we have come with the technology and with the impact and how to make this easier. And that is a little bit part also of the theme of the talk I want to have here. It's the vital role of spatial data playing in sustainable land management and forest management. And especially over the last years, the role it has played and is playing in policies from governments, companies, and especially the supply chain. And this presentation is developed together with Laura Very, who heads the Forest Data Partnership, which we'll talk later about, but unfortunately couldn't be here. So the spatial data is a prominent place in the land use and especially supply chain, because land is fast, forests are fast, and so how to get an overview, satellite data is very good for that. And it actually, you can see also that the spatial data and the land policies are often linked, because if you cannot see it and you don't know how to track it, it's very difficult to develop policies. And you see the data, what we see now in the previous presentation, we can actually much better understand where things are happening and also track it. And so these advancements in technology and availability of this new data gives us new opportunities, and also new opportunities for developing policies and understanding how things work, and especially on the supply chain side. As we saw also with United Cacao, I think it was a great example of how the supply chain tracking kind of works. And this effective monitoring on tracking chains and also be able to have policy impact in supply chains is really where this is about. And this is what I want to talk about, and especially the next presentation from our colleague Remy will focus on that. So how far we have come in this development. And next slide, please. We have so much has changed since 2014, when we officially launched Global Forest Watch. Because of the improvement on data, we actually also see at the same time that regulatory landscape is evolving. We are demanding great accountability from governments, from companies. Where does product origin, where does commodity come from? Where does my coffee come from, and what kind of impact it has? Questions we are think now we can ask, which weren't part of the questions that we could ask, a decade ago. And so there's even now, because we can do it, there's even more urgency and need for reliable and accurate data on all the different things, the deforestation. You saw where's cacao growing, where's coffee growing, and it demands for this geospatial data. So really underpins some of the meaningful government's commitments, policies of companies and of governments to enable this monitoring and actually to enable those policies and track the changes. So this increasing demand for traceability, transparency that we require is happening at the moment. And it's a real issue for many companies and governments to also keep track of, because it is a lot of things we ask. We certainly have to ask, like, we want to know where our coffee comes from. And a lot of companies weren't ready for it or are not ready for it. A lot of governments neither. And now with this new data and the new commitments, this is all coming together. And that is an interesting place that we are now on this world. And that is also where the Forest Data Partnership, or as we call it, FDAP, comes in. Again, Remy later on after my presentation will go deep on that. But you see in this slide, there's a lot of different groups coming together. There is the Unilever, a big food company, Google, the tech giant, the US government, and the United Nations Food and Agriculture Administration, FAO, coming together because all they see the same thing, like how can we use this data to actually help companies and government to track their supply chain better and work into better and more accessible and usable data. Because it's not only about the quantity and quality of data, it's also like how easy do you make it for companies and government and people to use that data. And I think that is where this FDAP and also GFW has played a big role for. So that there is this evolution going on. Maybe it's a revolution, maybe I call it an evolution of how we use data, how we can use data now for commodity transparency and traceability. And I think that is a new exciting part where we are and where FDAP is now working on, GFW Pro, where Liz talked about, is working on. So that's a whole new area of interest where our data can be used. And I'll happily later on, after my presentation, Remy will talk more about it. With that short introductory remark, I'd like to give it back to Isabella.
Excellent. Thank you, Fred. Thanks for setting the stage. Really excited to hear now from Remy, who's going to talk a bit more about the Forest Data Partnership and how, based off the work that we've setting the stage and foundation, everything that's been able to achieve to date through these great partnerships. Remy, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabella, and thank you for giving us the opportunity to present some of the work. Thanks, Fred, for the nice intro. So yeah, echoing what Liz mentioned in the first part of the webinar, we've had years of voluntary approaches to reduce deforestation linked to commodity production, but now we have mandatory regulations on the rise. And FAO, together with partners, has supported those voluntary approaches, in particular the REDD+ scheme, in developing robust and transparent forest monitoring systems. Now, those solutions are being used and adopted to support zero deforestation claims and see how proofs for zero deforestation can be made under those regulatory schemes. Before we dive into how particularly we tackle that in FAO together through different programs, the Forest Data Partnership co-led with WRI, but also the Aim for Forest program funded by the UK government, I would like to take one tiny step back, and if we can go to the next slide, to tackle a question that was actually asked today in the chat. I was pleased to see this one, which makes my first slide relevant. Is the issue between the land cover and land use aspects of things. So I'd like to really quickly go on the fact that remote sensing, at least as it is today, still gives us access to essentially land cover information. So biophysical properties of the land cover. However, the definitions that are underlying forest monitoring processes, whether they are voluntary or mandatory, are usually based on land use concepts. For instance, what we have access to in Global Forest Watch is mostly remote sensing based, so it's mostly land cover information. What we have access to in Global Forest Watch is essentially tree cover loss. And we know that tree cover loss is not always deforestation. And we also know that deforestation can theoretically occur without significant tree cover loss. If you look at the EUDR definition, for instance, deforestation is mostly a land use change, and land use change can actually happen without having substantial loss in the tree cover. And beyond the wealth of great information that's available in Global Forest Watch, there's very interesting little block parts, and I would really encourage you to look at those specific parts. The illustration I'm showing here today is extracted from Global Forest Watch, and it very clearly explains the difference between those two concepts. And if we keep this in mind, that we have actually land cover information in supply, and that what we try to do is address land use issues, we're already making one step further in clarifying and understanding the differences between products. So if we can go to the next slide, I would like to explain how we have integrated this difference between land cover and land use concepts into what we call convergence of evidence approach for supporting zero deforestation compliance to regulatory processes. So we know we have many different public available Earth observation maps, products, geospatial layers that are available to monitor forest, land use, tree cover. But those maps, those different products, they often differ, notably because of definition issues, like the one I just mentioned, but also just because of the classification processes and because we look at them at pixel level. And what's interesting is that at the plot level, at the farm level, we see actually much more convergence, especially when we implement clear land use definitions. And what is interesting is that different land cover products can actually contribute to providing consistent information on land use. That's also what Willy kind of showed earlier. With different land cover information, you can actually build a story and be in a position to tell the story around a specific area of interest, plot of land. So we actually advocate for a convergence of evidence approach within the Forest Data Partnership. And we have published this little descriptions of what we do and how we actually combine land cover information to support compliance under regulatory mechanisms. The code and the tools that we're developing in FAO with partners, with WRI, with many different stakeholders, are all open, and we really advocate for the fact that robust, transparent, and reproducible analysis requires public data sets and processes. And for this, we really need to acknowledge the great push that Global Forest Watch has represented over the past 10 years in making this a standard. This is definitely an inspiration that we take upon on. Next slide, please. So we have those concepts relatively clear. We have a convergence of evidence that we implement at the plot level. And while regulations like the UDR come with a lot of concern and questions around implementation, there's also strong momentum. There's also very interesting emerging structures, such as the Team Europe Initiative Zero Deforestation Hub that was launched at COP last year. And that comes with two main flagships: the technical facility that is led by EFI, European Forest Institute, as well as the Sustainable Agriculture for Forest Ecosystem project, SAFE. SAFE focuses on support to smallholders in the transition to sustainable value chains, assisting producing countries in creating an enabling environment to ensure maintained access to the EU market. And what we develop in the Forest Data Partnership falls within the umbrella of the SAFE initiative. And I'd like to showcase this. So next slide, please. Yeah, so under the SAFE umbrella, FAO, WRI, Google Earth Engine, many different partners, we are developing a prototype of digital public infrastructure with building blocks that are designed to draw and generate boundaries, to register them into an interoperable system and registry, to grab public geodata, layers of information on forest loss, on commodities, on changes of land cover in general, and then process them through public models so that we can generate information that can support for any given plot of land, whether points or polygons, a deforestation risk assessment. And we call that prototype WISP. It stands for what's in that plot, because that's the scale we look at, the plot, which is the relevant landscape unit to implement convergence of evidence. Like I mentioned earlier, WISP is based on as open, as public, and as free as possible solutions. And we have many different components already plugged into the infrastructure. Next slide, please. I will go very quickly through this one to just recall what we actually do within the process. We gather geospatial layers of information that are split between 4 thematic blocks: tree cover and forest, commodities, and then disturbances before and after a cutoff date, 2020. And what we do is compute zonal statistics on the plot, whether a point or a polygon, and organize the information into a decision tree to derive deforestation risk assessment in the sense of the regulation in that particular case, but that could be using other definitions. So that's just a scheme to show what's happening on the geospatial data analysis side. What is important is that we, at each of those blocks, advocate and implement a convergence of evidence, and the more data, the better. And in particular, one of the essential aspects of convergence of evidence is to acknowledge the role of nationally or regionally created data. So next slide, please. I would like to bring this particular example of Ivory Coast. Côte d'Ivoire released earlier this year a land use map for 2020 with information on one of the main commodities under the UDR scope, which is cocoa. And among other land use categories within the map, this particular piece of information is extremely useful to support the zero deforestation compliance claims. So we actually integrated it the day it was issued in the same way Global Forest Watch would integrate layers of data, and it is now integrated into the scope. So if you are actually analyzing pieces of plots of land in Côte d'Ivoire using WISP, you will access that particular piece of geospatial layer, and it really supports and really help understand better what's happening at the plot level. Next slide, please. I would like to insist on the fact that what we do under SAFE is really primarily targeting support to smallholders. WISP is today also implemented in Open Forest Ground. This is an open source project we co-developed within a Forest Data partnership with Google. It's a next generation data collection platform with enhanced offline features and computation capabilities that make it interoperable with many different key components of traceability systems. And what we do is allow smallholders to seamlessly generate those boundaries, georeference their plots, and generate that information that can support zero deforestation claims. We have it available on Android mobile devices, and we're really happy to support the further use of ground. You have examples of how it's being used in Kenya for the coffee sector, or in Ivory Coast in the cocoa sector. And we have more information. We should have a beta release launch probably next week, so stay tuned on this one. The application is already available on the Google Store, but the beta will be made available soon. Right, I would like to go on my almost last slide, sorry, to say that the process that we co-developed within the Forest Data Partnership is something that is completely free and open, and it's also completely anonymous. We don't store anything. We don't hold any of the data within the database. What we provide is a processing pathways, and geometries are processed on the fly. What you get is a simple table that contains the statistics for each of the layers we introduce in the analysis and the results of the decision tree. We aim to keep it as simple as possible. Really, the entry point is an API. It's available there at the URL you can see on screen. And we aim to keep it as simple as possible and open and free, because we want to actually make it adopted and available for many different processes. And we have different solution providers like InnerTrace from JZ, or Carto or TechnoServe that are already using it in their traceability solutions. FarmForce, the deforestation free trade gateway developed by the ITC WTO, is also one of them. The company called Sustain is already supporting it. And we're really happy to see this basically implementation of good practices using geospatial layers being adopted. So we have, just to finish, if you want more information, and if you can go to the last slide, we have a website that is dedicated to it. You can use and test the API. It will be further developed and further integrated into traceability solutions. Very happy to see that we have now designed solutions that try to reconcile those land cover and land use issues within simple products, really taking the inspiration from what Global Forest Watch has provided over the years and implemented in the end relatively simple things, but it is already powerful. So thank you very much. Happy to stay for questions.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Remy. Lots of great information covered. It's really incredible to see, I think Liz walked us through just the beginning of GFW and then how it has evolved, as Fred mentioned, and we're kind of in this stage where we're seeing more and more actors, diverse actors, from journalists to supply chain companies who are now, it's really shifting the narrative in the space. So really great to see these concrete examples and all the work that's been achieved through the Forest Data Partnership. So thank you again to all our speakers for excellent presentations. We're now going to move to the Q&A section of our webinar. We've already received a good handful of questions in the chat, so we can start with those. We also have some questions prepared in advance to prompt some discussion. I just wanted to give all of our speakers a chance to turn on their videos. They'll all be available to answer your questions. And I'll be moderating the ones that we've received first. So we received a few questions related to the EUDR, related to Willie's presentation. We have this one question that came in on thoughts on oil, palm, and LATAM and deforestation, especially with the EUDR pressures. I know firsthand in Colombia, oil palm industry puts forth a huge effort to stop this and to monitor, but very difficult with 30-meter satellite data and not secure to ground truth, all imagery deforestation signals. So I think it'd be great if we can open up with this question. Another attendee asked about solid examples of how GFW has been able to track deforestation in the supply chain, how the EUDR is implementing deforestation-free products as part of this policy. So I'd love to open up to Willie, Remy, Fred to maybe speak a bit more about how the EUDR is impacting this landscape and what's the opportunity to use GFW to leverage efforts to better monitor and track in the supply chain industry.
Yeah, I can respond to that first question about the palm oil industry in Latin America. And the insecurity of ground truthing information is a very real issue for the ability to actually go out and, verify satellite imagery. It is a very important part of this whole process that if it's physically impossible to do that, what are you going to do? You have to rely on local communities. And one of the things that we saw, especially with the pandemic, where travel was also not viable more broadly beyond a safety context, physical violence risks, because we had covered this topic for so long, people were willing to share information with us about what was going on in their communities and their lands where they live, so we don't have to travel there. And I think that example of the ground product that Remy was showing, but also all the products that fulfill this same purpose is to enable that to happen without traveling there. But that is based on trust, requires a lot of trust, which, I think communicating with people that they can use these mechanisms for, especially also for grievance reporting, that turns the story into data that can be used in these platforms as well. And so I think a lot of the answer to that is your ability to get information from local communities without traveling there, because it can be very difficult. And also obtaining information from governments You know, we've done a lot of work collecting information about fines or cases, official actions like in multiple countries in Latin America, and synthesizing that information. Sometimes it takes requests to government. And that's why that open data partnership, the Forest Data Partnership, is so important, because a lot of the work of getting down to the specifics of a case, you know, that isn't in a global repository of information. You have to keep searching if you want to do the work to verify the claims in good faith. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Willie, for answering that question. And I think it really helpful to see the different tools that can be used in this space that you've covered, that Remy also spoke to. And building off of that question, to kind of piggyback, we had a user who wanted to learn a bit more about solid examples of how GFW has been able to track deforestation in the supply chain. So what's the opportunity there to reduce deforestation in this industry? Would you like to speak to this, Fred, from GFW's side and other data sets? WRI.
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I think what I was trying to say, that we have actually doubled our efforts, because we have been involved in EUDR side links for the last 4 years. The EU law is so, if in one of the 7 commodities, coffee, cacao, there is after 2020 deforestation, you cannot import it into the EU. That's the law that will go into practice or into law in this December. So a lot of companies are wanting to know, like, okay, what's happening in my area? Is that deforestation? And so with FDAP, and Remy can talk about, one of the reasons we do a lot of this mapping to actually understand where's oil palm, where's cacao, so actually can be mapped that. And also GFW Pro on the other side is also very much focused on those issues on, can we come up with a map? There is a base map made by the Joint Research Center. Also, our data is involved in there. So that has been another issue where we have given our data to JRC, and JRC has made that into one map, which is the kind of base map. So we have focused on a lot of different areas in making sure that we can help a lot of the groups on making this better data. Any concrete examples? That is more what we are working on that, but we see it in oil palm, we see some coffee, but we haven't done those kind of analysis ourselves. So that is mostly with our partners, because mostly we work with companies to actually do this, and then hopefully they improve whatever they do. I don't know if that's enough. I don't know if Remy wants to say anything on this. He also works a lot on the EUDR as part of the FAO.
Yeah, maybe just to complement, we work at developing tools, not specifically supporting any regulation. The fact is that the UDR is coming up, and it imposes some constraints. So we're happy to see the tools that we've developed being used. I think one of the main positive aspects of what Global Forest Watch has done over the years is really to raise awareness. This has been clearly illustrated by what Willie showed today. That this source of information has been unique. And in the case of supply chains, I think it has already had a very strong impact. The fact that this regulation is coming up is pushing the major actors of the agri-food system production to find solutions. And they are being made aware that we have ways of detecting and monitoring those deforestation. So if there's anything that's really critical about it, is that this source of information that GFW or other systems represent is really already making a difference by making everyone be aware that we have ways of monitoring this deforestation, and that it will not go without consequence. And I think this in itself is extremely powerful. So plenty of benefits and for the environment and planet already in that sense.
Thanks, Remy. Thank you for the additional context here. And it's great to hear about the work that you're doing, and Willie, how it's different but really important use cases, and that the combined forces really excellent. And related to this theme, but kind of taking a step back more to Liz's presentation, we had a question that came in, just want to learn a bit more related to GFW about the term real time. While this has become very widely used in relation to space imagery, it would be great to clarify the actual latency of the imagery used in the GFW products. Would you like to speak to this a bit, Liz?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit. So it really just depends on the satellite that the information is coming from. And also another important factor is how cloudy of an area is that you're looking at. Because depending on, cloud cover, which is very common across the tropics, of course, you could have a satellite revisiting the same area, but because of cloud cover, if it's only available with, optical data, then we're not going to see the changes underneath the clouds. But there's several advances that have helped with some of these, right? So there's our radar-based data, which is able to penetrate through the clouds. That's available across the humid primary forests in the tropics. And we have a new combined data set as of a couple of years ago called integrated alerts that actually combines these different data sets together. So speaking about, convergence of evidence, instead of looking at all these different alert systems on their own, we can actually combine them and offer, increasingly like rapid information that's able to confirm across multiple systems if there's an alert happening. That's been really useful to users just to help simplify the process of going through all these different alerts and also more quickly confirm whether or not there's an alert. And the specifics, we're happy to share a blog about that, but the actual revisit time, again, is just depending on the satellite. So our GLAD Landsat data is an 8-day revisit time for a particular location. The GLAD S product, which is based on Sentinel data, is every 5 days. The RAD data is every 6 to 12 days. So yeah, it really just depends, and it depends on the cloud cover. And the last thing I'll say is that the latency question comes up in the annual data too, in an interesting way, because there can be times, especially toward the end of the year, if there's a lot of cloud cover or if there's fire activity, smoke and haze that's happening toward the end of the year, sometimes that isn't actually picked up in the same calendar year where that loss occurred. It kind of bleeds over into the next year. Because it's just, we don't have clear imagery to detect when that loss happened toward the end of the year. And, a clear example of that was the Indonesia fires that happened in 2015, at the end of 2015. A lot of that loss ended up showing up in the data in 2016 because there just weren't clear images of the loss that was happening. So yeah, it happens across different data sets. And that's just the trade-off with, rapid near real-time data is sometimes, it's hard to get those clear images.
Thanks, Liz, for providing that context. And just wanted to note for all those sending in questions, we're more than happy to answer questions related to the theme. But if you have anything you would like to learn more about, any specific data sets that we covered, or, we'll definitely share the links to our blog. Our Help Center has lots of great resources and materials as well. Just wanted to reemphasize that we'll cover topics more related in the spirit of the theme, but we're more than happy to connect also after this webinar if you have any other questions about the data sets we mentioned. I also wanted to queue up a question for Willie, building off of the impact from the United Cacao story. I just wanted to know if you could speak a bit more about the importance of continuing to monitor and report on these stories, and maybe also speak to the role of how the accessibility information and the importance of open available data contributed to this as well. So Willie, if you'd like to speak to those themes, that'd be really great.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important question when we're thinking about impact, because oftentimes, I think the key point is that avoiding deforestation is not a permanent impact. You can halt it in a case, but that doesn't stop that forest, the threat or the pressures on that forest. And so, in the United Cacao example, that company rebranded during the pandemic and tried to start again, and had a very significant campaign to try to change the outcomes that I mentioned during this call. And even they sued reporters and said, you can't use the word deforestation. And I know Remy, he gave a very specific definition of what deforestation is in his presentation, and that even concept was questioned. The good news is that, you know, almost a decade after this whole thing started, you know, the new subsidiary, the rebranded subsidiary, lost their case against Manga Bay. And we set a new precedent for impact that makes it more difficult for strategic lawsuits against public participation, these SLAP lawsuits, to happen in Peru. And that was a decade after the satellite picked up the primary forest loss. And so for me, the ongoing coverage, treating this deforestation as a kind of consistent news beat, is going to be so critical, like for changing mindsets and awareness around what's important. And also, I'm hoping that people will recognize that impact requires persistence, especially with these long-term goals to end deforestation in a decade from now, or 2030, or whatever date it ends up being, the UDR too. But I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Willie, for providing more context on the story. And it takes time to continue to monitor the impact, and more than just like headlines and beats. I think it's really, that's the change that we're seeing, that with all the great work that Manga Bay's been able to do. I also wanted to shift and address this question about historically GFW's data around the reputation of triggering false positives, to be practical. So I think it'd be a great time, if now it's been 10 years, Liz and Fred, I welcome you to address this question, talking about how the data sets have evolved in terms of changing the narrative around this reputation as well. So, would you like to go first, Liz or Fred?
Around false positives in the data.
Correct.
Yeah, we've done a lot of work over the years to help address that, I believe. I covered it a bit in my presentation, and that's been a big question right from the beginning. Of course, you know, tree cover loss is not deforestation. It's not the loss of natural forests. And there's a lot of loss that pops up in established tree plantations and tree crop areas that kind of muddies the data a bit, or muddies the story for people. And so, yeah, that's just been an active area of research for our team. We commissioned a very early on in the initiative, a plantation data set for key countries that helped us to start to filter out loss within plantation areas. And that has since grown into a larger data set called the Spatial Database of Planted Trees, which you can find on technical documentation on WRI's website and on Global Forest Watch platform as well, the data set. And that has been very useful for, again, just filtering out loss within, non-natural forest areas, planted areas, orchards, tree crops. And that has been a building block to a number of data sets that have come out recently that try to map natural forests. So Science-Based Target Network released a data set on natural lands, including a natural forest class, in which the Spatial Database of Planted Trees was a key input. JRC also used the Spatial Database of Planted Trees in their forest map for EUDR implementation purposes. And we now are getting ready to release that SBTN natural forest map on Global Forest Watch, and offering some statistics on loss within natural forests. So understood, that this false positive narrative was very real, and I think we've made a lot of strides to improve it over the years.
Thanks, Liz, so much for that helpful context. And while I have you, because I think this will also be helpful question, we received this in Spanish, but I'll translate to English about the difference between deforestation and forest loss. I think especially for new users understanding what the data can do or can't do, and also what does it really mean. So if you'd like to also address this question. Great.
Yeah, sure. So over the years, Global Forest Watch, we've tried to be very careful about the terminology that we use when we're referring to our data sets. Tree cover loss, like I just said, is not deforestation. Tree cover loss is just the loss of tree canopy cover, at a 30-meter pixel scale. It doesn't go on to identify if that was, a natural forest or a planted forest. Or what the eventual change ended up being. And both of those pieces of information are needed to move from tree cover loss to forest loss, which I think is the loss of, natural forests or forests under the FAO definition, which can include planted forest areas, or deforestation, which is then following that loss through the land use change trajectory and figuring out what actually became of that loss. Was it loss which just regrew back into a secondary forest, in which case it wasn't deforestation? Or was it loss that resulted in a conversion to agriculture or an urban area or some other land use change, in which case we could identify that it's deforestation. And that is much trickier to do. I think there's a lot of, work, ongoing research out there that is attempting to track deforestation. We have an indicator of agricultural linked deforestation on the Global Forest Review that we're working to update, that tracks 7 key commodities, which are the same EUDR commodities. And then there are other, studies, especially at like country level or regional levels. But because there's often complex land use change transitions, or land can sit idle for a number of years, it just it's tricky to actually confirm that there was a deforestation event that has taken place, and it's not something that we offer like annual updates on currently on Global Forest Watch, because it takes time to confirm that information.
Really helpful. Thanks, Liz. We'll take a handful. We have a few more questions. We'll try and get through probably a few more, but of course, if there's any questions that we didn't have time for during the webinar, I really invite you all to email us at gfw@deborah.org. I'll also include the email in the chat again, but we'll get through a few more. We have a question about there have been differences on the definitions of primary and secondary forests between GFW and the government of Indonesia, with the upshot of the through the Ministry of Forestry requested to correct their data. And so this user would like to learn more about how these differences been resolved. And I think it'd be best suited. Fred, would you like to speak a bit to this about the situation, the differences between the definitions of primary and secondary forest in GFW? And I think it's also a theme we see with other governments as well. So I'll hand it to you.
Thanks. And it has a little bit to do also with the talk that Remy had about land use, land cover. Countries have their own definition of what is forest. And so Indonesia has that too, as other countries. And we have worked with Indonesia. And so it was very good to work with them, because they have a different definition what is primary, what is secondary. Well, we as Global Forest Watch have a global definition what's primary, what is secondary. So there was a difference in we never changed our data. Our data needs to be comparable and needs to be independent of governments, and that is one of our core values, I think. But what we did with Indonesian government was taking our change data and taking their definition of primary and secondary curves and combine those. And if you go to the GFW graph, you will see our graph, but you also see the data that comes from the Indonesian government. So we show them a little bit next to each other. And I think that happens in many countries. Every country has a little bit different definition of what is primary, what is secondary, what is changed. And so our data is globally and has to, by definition, we have one definition so that it's able to compare countries. And that means sometimes that our numbers are different than official government numbers. And so that is one of the issues that we think give a value, because the country level definition, of course, FAO has them too. And so we compare that. And so we can also work with the FAO to compare those data. But that's just part inherent in our work. But we love to work with government. It was a very interesting cooperation with Indonesia. It was by understanding each other's data and not changing each other's data, we actually understand much better the issues in Indonesia. And I think Indonesia better understand our data. So that was a very interesting cooperation.
Thank you, Fred. Very, very helpful and enlightening. I did want to hand it to Remy. I know we got a few questions about the WISP tool, so I wasn't sure if Remy would like to speak a bit more about users who might be interested in learning more. I think we had a question about is it available for commercial usage, whether products can build on top of that, maybe a bit more about the open source licensing. We got some questions about some more specifics on the technical side, but would you like to speak more about the WISP tool and its availability for those who want to learn more after this webinar?
Yeah, I'd love to do that. Thank you. I clarify this. I think one of the aspects we took inspiration from Global Forest Watch is the transparency aspects. The tools we've developed under the Open Forest Initiative are all completely open source. You can access the code. It's there to be checked, and there's in some way it reflects the fact that you can't take my word for saying anything unless it's actually verifiable and reproducible for any. And this is typically what GFW has really helped do is go towards this more open and more transparent aspects of information. So the code for WISP is open. It's we set it up under MIT license, so it's totally available for commercial use or even by product if you want. Just to let you know that it's powered on Earth Engine, and the notebooks that are powering WISP can be implemented in any Earth Engine account. So if you have a commercial license and you want to use it at very large scale, you can do so. We actually have companies that are already doing this. We are also looking into what long-term solutions we could have to provide a service account that could power it, but at the moment it's the responsibility of each user to use its own license. But yes, otherwise the code and the tool itself is completely open, including for commercial usage. There was a question on the planet data earlier in the chat, and I would just like to echo on this one to also say that ground truthing is indeed fundamental. There's nothing that can replace good information taken from the ground. On the supply chain side, for instance, when you look at shaded cocoa coffee, it's sometimes very, very difficult from just remote sensing products to actually see what's happening. And in those cases, nothing replaces good ground information. In some cases, it's also very difficult to go back in time. And for this, high resolution, both spatially and temporally, is critical. And I think the planet data made available by the NICFI program has been really instrumental in providing verifiable ways. And of course, it's still satellite imagery, but it's very precious satellite imagery to look at. Within the Global Forest Watch platform, you can access the planet data to verify alerts, events, and to actually provide objective and interpreted information from those. We make huge usage of them to also look at what's happening with zero deforestation claims, for instance, through our different platforms, through the Earth Map tool, for instance. So I wanted to say that in addition to boots on the ground, there's also very precious information that can be derived from data such as the planet data sets, from careful, objective as possible interpretation. Yeah.
Thanks, Remy. Really helpful, and thanks for also shedding light on the other question around the planet imagery, we actually invited our partners from the NICFI Satellite Data Program from Planet and KSAT at our previous webinar that we kicked off our Voices series. So for those who attended, we'll reshare the link, but they talked a bit more about the program, the availability of Planet, how to access it on GFW. I also wanted to invite Lily, not to be in the spot, but I also know that MongoDB uses the Planet imagery very closely in your work. It really helps highlight what's happening on the ground when you all are ground truthing. Just curious if you'd like to speak more about that in terms of how you use GFW, maybe really some of the examples you featured and how open accessible data has led to this impact.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, we are heavy users of satellite information. That is very clear. For us, it is often a lead, like the integrated alerts are not only based on that, they're not based on that imagery. But when you have the integrated alerts plus the daily imagery, you have more opportunities to find the contributing, or what was it called? What did you call it? The combination of evidence.
Convergent.
So we're cross-referencing. That's what we're doing. We're cross-referencing with a lot of different things. Having that frequency matters quite a bit. So that interplay between the radar's picking up this and you can see it in this way, and if you build out the context with GFW data to help try and understand a bit more beyond what you can learn from the satellite imagery itself, that's critically important. But I also know that, when people see that image, it is a very strong source of evidence when you were able to see. And this was also true with the Amazon fires. If we're looking back in time a little bit, 2019, 2020, I think it was a 2019 fire season where smoke went over Sao Paulo and the whole world took notice. Though that wasn't particularly a big fire year in comparison, but it captured social media attention. And there was a lot of fake images out there, because it was just starting. And so people were using old fire images and saying, this isn't even really happening. And so at that time, we went direct to Planet and said, can we get pictures of what's happening with these fires, and put them out in public domain quickly? And so, I think that ability to see it really matters. And I think that's one of the real great values of that daily. It's the cross-referencing, it's the clarity, the high resolution, and it's, the availability of it. That is kind of a standard source is also, why it's valuable for us. But I hope that answers the question.
Thanks. Well, I just know you all have worked very closely with using the Planet imagery, so I thought you could shed a bit of light of how you've used it, and really draws nicely to the point of.
The other big example of it that I think is probably worth mentioning, but the Amazon Mining Watch, which is, started as a relation with journalists, including MongoDB, but primarily the Pulitzer Center and Earth Genome. That's now being taken up by Amazon Conservation and spearheaded to use this type of imagery and computer vision to detect expansion of mining sites in the Amazon. I know we were talking a lot about agriculture today, but it's also relatively clear from satellite imagery, like when a mine is happening. You can see it and you can detect it faster. And so that, I think that's where the daily matters too, because timeliness matters.
Absolutely. We can't track what we can't see, and I think it's so fascinating to see how much GFW has evolved to be able to provide those near time alerts and to be able to actually go and see things that the satellite imageries weren't able to detect, and be able to really be notified immediately when something is happening on the ground. So thanks for speaking more to that, Willie. And also we'll plug that we have another webinar coming up later this year that will be talking a bit more about mining, looking at how we have users that have been using data and tools like GFW to, one, raise awareness and understand what's happening on the ground. Stay tuned for that. It's another webinar we're excited to put on. I'll wrap up with a few more questions. I know we're almost out of time, and just wanted to say thanks again for saying all these great questions. I've included some links in the chat. Of course, if we didn't have time to answer your question, please reach out to our email. I also include a link to our website where you can access our map and dashboards that we covered today and our help center. But I'll wrap up with a question for Liz. I thought this would be interesting since a lot of users and partners map biomass. We are very familiar with them. So this person had a question about the map biomass data and their research. They greatly admire the work Global Forest Watch has done. And if you could please share some of the advantages, Liz, of what the GFW data might offer in the Brazilian context compared to map biomass or terra class. Also, is there any collaboration between GFW and these Brazilian programs? I'll hand it to Liz to speak a bit to that.
Yeah, sure. Happy to speak to this a little bit. Yeah, I mean, of course, we greatly admire the map biomass data and also, Protus and Deter available from INPE on Terra class. And I think it depends as far as like what additional information GFW can offer. I think it really depends on the question you're asking, the scale of your analysis, and whether or not the forest definitions mapped in those data sets are capturing what you're trying to ask in your research or with your questions. In general, I think they can all offer complementary information. Again, like building on this multiple lines of evidence or convergence of evidence approach, these data sets all offer, different pros and cons. Map biomass being that it's very tailored to a specific context. So if you're only working in Brazil, then that very well might be the best data that's available for your question or for your research. And it's possible that Global Forest Watch might offer some benefits too, though, depending on, if you want to take advantage of our ability to, modify the tree canopy density threshold. If you wanted to have some variability to how you're defining your forest, that's something you can do with Global Forest Watch data. We also, of course, offer information across the globe. So if you're trying to compare what you're seeing in Brazil to other countries, then, Global Forest Watch is going to be a good data set for that use. And we also publish a bit faster because we're focusing on just the loss, whereas Map Biomass has this larger land cover data. It takes a bit longer to create. If you need information a bit faster, we typically publish in April or May. So, that's another factor to consider. And the Protus question is interesting too, because, that's a gold standard monitoring system. It monitors clear-cut losses in primary forests, and it uses a minimum area of 6.25 hectares. So if that meets your needs, then that is a great system to use. And it's one that's widely used, of course. But if you wanted to monitor, losses from fires or losses in secondary forests or losses that are smaller scale than 6.25 hectares, or things that aren't just clear-cut loss, then another system like Global Forest Watch might be better. So, it's not a very satisfactory answer because it just depends. And there's actually a lot of blogs that we've written comparing some of these different systems that you can find on our Global Forest Watch blog. If you just scroll through and search for like technical blogs, there's a lot of useful information there.
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. And thanks for providing that context. I mean, there's many different data sets and systems that we touched on today. This could be definitely, we could spend more time talking about it, but just want to thank you all for the great discussion. We received one last question about solutions to combat deforestation, but I thought in relation to the theme, to kind of close us out, I invite all of our speakers to give any final closing remarks related to anything looking forward in the space, recommendations in terms of coming together to combat deforestation. So I'll open it up to our speakers. Remy, would you like to go first for any final remarks? And very briefly, since we're almost at time.
Deforestation and degradation. Now we have those mandatory regulatory approaches on the rise. I guess it's gonna take a joint convergence of efforts and initiatives to keep this curve, but certainly tools like Global Forest Watch will help consolidate those efforts, and there's still work ahead.
I guess I can go next. Yeah, just very brief comments. Thank you everybody for joining and listening in. I think the things that we're doing today are going to have impacts for years into the future. That's for me what the story of the last 10 years is that the things that we did at the beginning are still having impact now. Things that we're doing now are going to have impact for years to come. So yeah, persistence is key. That's my
Keep on the good fight. Liz?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And in addition to what was already shared, for corporate commitments or regulations, I just think political will is so important, right? Electing people that really prioritize forests, the climate crisis, environmental protections is big and just has ripple effects across policies in a given country. And then economic incentives that actually increase the value of standing forests is another big one that needs to be, just more effort put behind. And then, of course, the last one I wanted to mention is just securing the rights of Indigenous peoples, right? They are our best stewards of forests, and the more we can do to recognize their rights and support them, the better off our forests will be. Thanks.
My answer would be now is the time for data, spatial data. The regulatory frameworks are there, as Remy said. There's a lot of voluntary. There's now also compliance needs. The data is there. AI tools are there. Now is the time, and I completely agree with Liz. What we need to do to get more value in forest and reduce deforestation. But there is also now the time for having data evidence, what's happening, where it is happening, and who is doing it, and actually use that transparency of data to actually make the next step in reducing deforestation and increase sustainability.
Thank you, Fred. Thank you to all our speakers. I know we're just over time, but I think what better way to end our webinar with these inspiring thoughts. So I just want to thank you all to our speakers again for the time and dedication to your work and being available to share this with our great audience. And as a reminder, everyone who registered for the webinar, you'll receive a copy of today's webinar, the recording, including the slides. So thank you again for joining us. Stay tuned for our next webinar later this fall. We'll have the third webinar as part of our Voices of GFW series. So thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye.